My best friend stayed late helping me pack, then pointed at my bed. Which side is mine? Reese stood in the middle of my half-assembled bed frame at 11 at night, hands on her hips, surveying it like a general inspecting a battlefield, and asked the question so casually I almost missed how much it mattered. Which side is mine? I had a screwdriver in one hand and absolutely no idea how to answer. What I managed, which wasn't an answer at all, more of a stalling tactic, while my brain tried to catch up to what she'd just said. The bed. Which side? I've been sleeping on the left my whole life, but I'll negotiate if you feel strongly about it. She said it lightly, already moving to grab another box. Like she hadn't just asked me a question that rearranged the entire shape of the night. I stood there holding a screwdriver, staring at a bed frame that belonged to my new apartment, wondering if she'd meant it as a joke, or if some part of her had meant it exactly the way it sounded, and too scared to ask which one, in case the answer was neither. My name's Nolan Reid. I'm 27, and I make my living building things, cabinets mostly, custom furniture, the occasional full kitchen remodel, working out of a small shop I rent on the edge of Traverse City, Michigan. I like projects with a beginning, middle, and end. You cut the boards, you join them, you sand the edges down until they stop catching splinters, and eventually you have something solid enough to hold weight. Relationships, I'd learned over the years, didn't work like that. There was no clear joinery, no sanding down the rough parts until they stopped catching. I'd spent most of my adult life avoiding that kind of unpredictable project altogether, which had worked out fine for me, right up until the night my best friend asked me which side of my new bed belonged to her. I'd inherited a healthy respect for careful, deliberate work from my grandfather, who'd run a small furniture shop of his own for 40 years before I was ever born, and who'd taught me, over long summers spent in his workshop as a kid, that rushing a joint always showed eventually, no matter how good it looked when it was fresh. I'd carried that lesson into most areas of my life without meaning to, applying the same patient, deliberate caution to my friendships and relationships that I applied to a dovetail joint, which had made me reliable and steady in most people's eyes, and, I was slowly starting to realize, occasionally too cautious for my own good when it actually mattered. Reese Callahan and I had known each other since college, 9 years now, long enough that the friendship had outlasted 3 of my relationships and 2 of hers, long enough that neither of us could remember exactly when we'd started finishing each other's sentences or developed the specific shorthand best friends build up over a decade of inside jokes nobody else understood. She worked as a veterinary technician at a clinic downtown, came home most nights, smelling faintly of antiseptic and dog fur, and had a habit of narrating her day to me over the phone in such vivid detail that I sometimes felt like I'd been there myself, holding some anxious golden retriever steady while it got its shots. We'd met freshman year, assigned as lab partners in an introductory biology class neither of us particularly cared about, and had bonded over a shared inability to identify which end of a dissected frog was which. By sophomore year, we were the kind of friends who had a standing Sunday dinner, who knew each other's coffee orders without asking, who could read each other's moods across a crowded room well enough to know when the other one needed rescuing from a bad conversation. Neither of us had dated much during those years, both of us apparently too busy building a friendship that felt, even then, more foundational than most people's actual relationships. I'd had 2 serious girlfriends after college, both relationships that had eventually foundered on the same rock, both women telling me, in different words, some version of the same complaint, that I seemed to already have the most important relationship in my life sorted out, and it wasn't with them. I'd never taken that criticism as seriously as I probably should have. At the time, I'd told myself Reese was just my best friend, the way anyone's best friend might loom large in their life, and that the women I dated simply didn't understand how important platonic friendship could be. It took me embarrassingly long to consider the more obvious explanation. For most of those 9 years, the shape of our friendship had been simple and unambiguous. We were the 2 people who showed up for each other. I fixed her garbage disposal. She talked me through my parents' divorce 4 years back, sitting on my kitchen floor at 2 in the morning because I hadn't been able to sleep and hadn't wanted to be alone with it. We'd been each other's plus ones at more weddings than either of us could count, had developed a running joke about it, had a whole bit we did at every reception about how we were basically married already. Minus the parts that would have made it complicated. It had always gotten a laugh. It had also, somewhere in the last 2 or 3 years, stopped feeling entirely like a joke to me, though I'd never once let myself examine that too closely. The same careful avoidance I applied to most things that scared me. I'd noticed the shift for real about 18 months ago, at somebody else's wedding, watching Reese laugh at something the best man said, and feeling a spike of something ugly and possessive I had no business feeling about my best friend. I'd told myself it was the champagne. I'd told myself the same thing for the better part of a year and a half. Right up until the night, everything actually came to a head. Standing in my empty new apartment with a bed frame that only had one working side rail and absolutely no plan for how to answer her question. That wedding sat in my memory with a particular clarity most memories didn't earn. The two of us dancing to a slow song neither of us particularly liked. Her head resting against my shoulder without either of us commenting on it. The specific, comfortable weight of a friendship that had quietly, over years, started asking more of both of us than either of us had ever admitted out loud. I remember thinking, somewhere in the middle of that song, that I couldn't picture my life without her in it in some capacity, and being too scared of what that thought actually implied to examine it any further that night, or for the 18 months that followed. Looking back, I think that wedding was the moment the friendship quietly tipped into something else, even though neither of us said a single word about it for another year and a half. I think about all the ordinary interactions in between, the phone calls that ran an hour longer than they needed to, the way I'd started checking my phone for her name specifically, instead of just checking it generally, the way certain plans with other people had started feeling like obligations while plans with her never did. None of it, taken individually, had seemed significant enough to name together. In retrospect, it had been building toward exactly the night the bed frame question finally forced both of us to look at it directly. I'd found the apartment 3 weeks earlier, a 2-bedroom above a bakery on the north side of downtown, the kind of place with good light and slightly uneven floors that I'd fallen for the second I walked through the door. Moving day itself had been chaos in the ordinary way moving days are. A rented truck, 4 trips up 2 flights of stairs, my back complaining by hour 3 in a way that suggested I was closer to 30 than I liked to admit. Reese had shown up at 8 that morning with coffee and donuts from the bakery downstairs, had stayed the entire day without me ever having to ask twice, had organized my kitchen boxes by category while I was still figuring out how to get the couch through a doorway it was clearly not designed to fit through. By noon we'd fallen into an easy rhythm, her directing traffic on where furniture should actually go while I did the heavy lifting, both of us bickering good-naturedly about whether the bookshelf belonged in the living room or the spare bedroom. I was already half planning to turn into a workshop. She'd found my old college yearbook buried in a box of books around 2 in the afternoon and spent a solid 20 minutes narrating embarrassing photos of both of us at parties neither of us fully remembered, laughing so hard at one particular picture of me in a Halloween costume that she'd had to sit down on an unopened box to recover. It was, in retrospect, exactly the kind of ordinary, comfortable day that made it so easy to miss what was actually happening underneath it. 2 people who'd spent 9 years building an entire shared language, slowly filling a new space with the specific evidence of how thoroughly their lives had already merged. Around 6, both of us exhausted and sweaty, and surrounded by more cardboard than either of us wanted to look at for the rest of the evening, we took a break, sitting on the floor of the empty living room with our backs against the wall, sharing the last 2 slices of pizza from lunch that had gone cold hours earlier and tasted fine anyway because we were too hungry to care. "This is nice," Reese said, tipping her head back against the wall, eyes closed. "Exhausting, but nice. I like being the person who helps you build a life instead of just hearing about it secondhand. You're not just hearing about it secondhand. You've been here for basically all of it." "I know. I like it, is what I'm saying." She opened one eye to look at me, something soft in her expression that I filed away without examining too closely. The same careful avoidance I'd applied to a dozen other moments like it over the following 2 weeks. You're going to be happy here, Nolan. I can already tell. I hope so. I looked around at the half-assembled chaos of my new living room, at the woman sitting beside me, who'd spent an entire day helping me build it without once complaining, and felt something warm and unnamed settle in my chest that I chose, that evening, not to think too hard about. By 11 that night, most of the apartment was in some state of controlled chaos. Boxes stacked against walls, furniture in the wrong rooms waiting to be moved to the right ones. And the two of us were down to the last project of the night, my bed frame, which had come with instructions written by someone who apparently hated both English and furniture assembly in equal measure. This bolt doesn't match this hole, Reese said, holding up 2 pieces that clearly belonged together but were refusing to cooperate. Let me see. I crossed the room, took the pieces from her, and after a minute of squinting realized the instructions had us building the headboard upside down. We've been doing this wrong for 20 minutes. I feel like that's a metaphor for something, but I'm too tired to figure out what. She dropped onto the half-finished mattress, stretching out with a groan, staring up at the ceiling. Your new apartment has good bones. Nolan, I like it here. You've been here 12 hours. You've mostly seen the inside of moving boxes. I have excellent spatial reasoning. I can tell good bones from bad ones regardless of box density. She sat back up, watching me work on the frame for a minute, her expression going quieter than the joking tone she'd been using all day. I'm going to miss this. You know, not this apartment specifically. Since I've been here 12 hours and it's mostly boxes, I mean this. Us. Doing ordinary things together. Building furniture. Arguing about bookshelf placement. I don't get enough of just this. You get plenty of this. We hang out constantly. It's different when it's your actual life. Though, not just visiting hours. She said it lightly, but something underneath it landed heavier than the words themselves. And I felt it without quite being able to name what I'd felt, before I could figure out how to respond. She stood up, walked over to survey the half-built bed with her hands on her hips, and asked the question that stopped my entire evening cold. Which side is mine? I looked up from the screwdriver, certain I'd misheard her, and found her looking back at me with an expression I couldn't quite categorize. Somewhere between a joke she was testing out loud and something a lot more sincere, hiding just underneath it. What I said, which bought me exactly 0 time to figure out an actual response. The bed. Which side? I've been sleeping on the left my whole life. But I'll negotiate if you feel strongly about it. She said it lightly, moving to grab another box before I could answer. The specific, evasive maneuver of someone who'd said something slightly too honest and was already retreating from it, just planning ahead. For sleepovers, when I'm too tired to drive home after helping you build furniture at midnight. Right, I said, my voice coming out rougher than I meant it to. Sleepovers. Obviously. She didn't look at me while she said it, busying herself with a box of kitchen supplies instead, and I stood there holding a screwdriver, my heart doing something complicated and fast, trying to figure out whether I'd just been handed an opening or imagined one entirely. I didn't say anything else about it that night. We finished the bed frame around midnight, argued about whether the headboard was actually level, ordered pizza we ate sitting on the floor because none of my furniture was fully assembled yet, and around 1 in the morning Reese called a rideshare and left with a wave and a don't die of exhaustion building shelves. Alone tomorrow. The same easy affection she always signed off with. Nothing in her tone suggesting the question from earlier had been anything other than the joke she'd clearly decided to let it be. I lay awake in that new bed for a long time after she left, staring at the ceiling of an apartment that suddenly felt too big and too quiet, replaying 4 words on a loop. Which side is mine? I told myself it didn't mean anything. I told myself the same thing I'd been telling myself for 18 months, and I believed it about as much as I ever had, which was not at all. I thought about all the small moments that had built up to that question over the preceding months, moments I'd catalogued and dismissed one by one without ever adding them together into a total. The way she'd started texting me good morning before either of us needed anything specific from the other. The way she'd shown up to help with the move without me having to ask. the way she'd apparently already decided, without discussion, that she'd be the one organizing my kitchen, hanging my curtains, making the ordinary decisions of a shared life before either of us had actually agreed we were sharing one. I'd noticed every individual piece and somehow managed to avoid noticing the shape they made together, until a half-joking question about bedsides forced me to finally look at the whole picture at once. Lying awake at 1 in the morning, with absolutely no idea what to do about any of it, I didn't bring it up the next day, or the day after that, or really at any point over the following 2 weeks. Both of us settling into the ordinary rhythm of my new apartment, slowly filling in around its half-unpacked boxes. Reese came by often, helping me hang shelves. Picking out curtains with an opinion so specific, I let her just handle the whole project. Showing up with takeout on nights I was too tired from shop work to cook. It felt, on the surface, exactly like it always had. Underneath that surface, something had shifted, subtle but unmistakable. A kind of charged quiet that hadn't been there before, present in the half-second pause before either of us spoke sometimes. In the way she'd started staying later than she needed to. In the way I'd started finding reasons to ask her to stay later still. My friend Jordan noticed it before I was willing to admit it out loud myself. Jordan worked with me at the shop, had known Reese almost as long as I had, and had a talent for saying uncomfortable things bluntly enough that you couldn't pretend you hadn't heard them. "You two are being weird," he said one afternoon, about 2 weeks after the move, both of us sanding down a set of cabinet doors for a client. "We're not being weird. Reese picked out your curtains. Nolan, your curtains. You've never once in 9 years let that woman make a decorating decision without a 20-minute debate. And now she just shows up with fabric swatches, and you say thank you, and hang them." He didn't look up from his sanding block, which somehow made the observation land harder. Something's different. Nothing's different. Aha. He gave me the same skeptical look he gave a piece of wood with a hidden crack in it. The look that said he knew something was wrong under the surface even if it wasn't visible yet. Whatever it is, man, you should probably figure it out before one of you says something you can't take back at exactly the wrong moment. There's nothing to figure out. Sure there isn't. He set down his sanding block and looked at me directly, the way he only did when he actually cared about the answer, instead of just needling me for fun. "I've watched you date exactly 2 women in the whole time I've known you, and both times you talked about Reese more than you talked about them. That's not a normal amount of talking about your best friend. Nolan, I'm not trying to start something. I just think you should be honest with yourself before you're 40 and still pretending you don't know what's obvious to literally everyone who's ever seen the 2 of you in the same room." I didn't have a good answer for that, so I just went back to sanding, and Jordan let it drop, though not without one last parting shot as he headed toward the front of the shop. "Just don't wait too long. Good things like that don't always sit around waiting for you to catch up." I didn't figure it out. Not really. Not over those 2 weeks. I kept circling the same 4 words, kept almost bringing it up and then losing my nerve, kept telling myself there'd be a better time, a clearer sign, some kind of permission I didn't actually need but was waiting for anyway. It was Reese, in the end, who forced the issue. Not through another loaded question but through a housewarming party she basically organized on my behalf, inviting half our shared friend group over on a Saturday 2 weeks after the move. Apparently deciding I'd been avoiding actually settling in and taking matters into her own hands. "You've lived here 2 weeks and you still have unopened boxes in the hallway," she'd told me over the phone, 3 days before the party. "I'm inviting people over so you're forced to finish unpacking before Saturday. This is an intervention disguised as a party. That's manipulative. It's effective, which is different." She'd laughed, easy and warm the way she always sounded on the phone. And I'd spent the better part of those 3 days scrambling to finish unpacking, motivated less by the threat of an audience, and more, if I was honest with myself, by wanting the apartment to look like the kind of place she'd want to keep spending time in. The party itself started easy enough. 12 or so people crowded into my still slightly under-furnished apartment, somebody's playlist going. The specific, comfortable chaos of a gathering of people who'd known each other long enough not to need to perform for one another. Reese had shown up early to help set up, had brought a folding table from her own apartment, because I didn't own enough furniture yet to hold all the food people were bringing, and had spent the hour before guests arrived narrating a running commentary on my sparse decorating choices that had both of us laughing hard enough that I nearly dropped an entire tray of appetizers. It was Mila, one of Reese's co-workers from the vet clinic, who lit the fuse without meaning to, cornering me by the kitchen counter about an hour in, with a drink in hand, and absolutely no filter. "So when did you two finally get together?" she asked, gesturing vaguely toward where Reese stood, laughing with a group by the window. "We're not together." "Could have fooled me. She picked your curtains. She's rearranged your entire kitchen twice since the move. She talks about you the way people talk about someone they're already planning a future with, not someone they're just friends with." Mila took a sip of her drink, studying me with the same unbothered curiosity she probably brought to diagnosing a sick animal, unaware or unconcerned that she was picking apart something I'd spent 18 months carefully not looking at directly. "You should probably tell her that, because from where I'm standing, it looks pretty obvious. It's not that simple." "Sure it is. You just haven't said it yet." She shrugged, entirely unbothered by the weight of what she'd just casually dropped into my evening, and wandered off toward the snack table, leaving me standing there with a beer going warm in my hand and absolutely no ability to focus on anything else happening at my own party. I didn't get a chance to process that properly before Jordan, apparently sensing an opportunity too good to waste, raised his glass across the room and called out, loud enough for most of the party to hear, "To Nolan and Reese. 9 years running and still pretending they're just friends." And the room, predictably, erupted into the kind of good-natured teasing that had followed us to every wedding and gathering for the better part of a decade. Except this time it landed differently. This time, Reese's face went a shade of pink I'd never quite seen on her before. And this time, neither of us laughed it off with the usual practiced ease. "You two should just get married already," someone else called out, and the room laughed again, and I watched Reese's expression do something complicated, amusement and something rawer underneath it, and I understood, standing there in my own kitchen with 12 people watching, that the joke had officially stopped being a joke for both of us, whether either of us was ready to say so out loud or not. She found me on the back balcony about 20 minutes later, having apparently decided the party needed some air, or maybe having decided the two of us needed a minute away from an audience. "That got weird fast," she said, leaning against the railing beside me, not quite looking at me directly. "Mila asked me when we got together. Jordan toasted us like we're already married." She laughed, short and a little nervous, an unfamiliar sound coming from someone who was rarely nervous about anything. "Everyone's been making that joke for 9 years. I don't know why it landed differently tonight." The city lights were coming up over the rooftops behind her, and for a moment neither of us said anything, both content to just stand there in the cool night air, the party noise muffled behind the glass door. The two of us alone for the first time all evening, maybe because it's not entirely a joke anymore, I said, before I could stop myself, the words coming out faster than I'd planned them. 4 words that felt a lot like admitting something I'd spent 18 months carefully not admitting. Reese went very still beside me. "What did you just say?" I said maybe it's not entirely a joke. I made myself keep going, my heart pounding hard enough that I was fairly sure she could hear it. "The bed thing. 2 weeks ago. You asked which side was yours, and I've thought about it every single night since. And I don't think either of us actually meant it as a throwaway question." For a long moment she didn't say anything, just looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read in the dim balcony light, and I braced myself for her to laugh it off, to say something that would let both of us retreat back to safe ground, back to 9 years of careful, comfortable distance. "I meant it," she said instead, quiet, almost surprised at her own honesty. "I've meant it for a while now. Actually, I just didn't know how to say it without risking everything we already have." "Same," I admitted. "I've been standing at the edge of this for about 18 months, telling myself it was nothing, because the alternative meant risking the best friendship I've ever had on something that might not work." 18 months. She let out a small, disbelieving laugh. "I've been sitting on this since roughly the same amount of time. We could have saved ourselves a year and a half of tiptoeing around each other if either of us had just said something." Where would the fun be in that? I reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. The same gesture that had felt impossible to justify 18 months earlier and now felt like the easiest thing in the world. I think some part of me needed the slow version, needed to be sure it wasn't just loneliness or convenience talking, that it was actually you. Specifically, not just the idea of not being alone. And now I think I'd rather risk it than spend another 18 months pretending I don't know which side of that bed I want you sleeping on. The words came out steadier than I felt, but they were true. Truer than almost anything I'd said in years. She let out a breath, something between a laugh and a sob, and closed the distance between us before I could second-guess anything further. Her hand finding the front of my shirt the same way it had on countless casual hugs over 9 years. Except this time it didn't feel casual at all. For the record, she murmured, the left side. I've been telling myself it was a joke, but I meant the left side. Noted, I said, and kissed her. And it wasn't careful or hesitant, the way I'd expected a first kiss with my best friend of 9 years to feel. It was 2 weeks of almost 18 months of careful avoidance, collapsing into something neither of us had planned for, and both of us had apparently wanted for a long time. We stayed out on that balcony for a while after, the party noise carrying on behind us, both of us laughing at intervals about how obvious we'd apparently been to literally everyone except ourselves. When we finally went back inside, Jordan took one look at us and raised his glass again, this time without a hint of a joke in it. Finally, he said, and the whole room seemed to exhale along with him, like they'd all been waiting years for exactly this moment to arrive. The weeks that followed were easier than I expected, in the specific way that things are easier once you stop spending all your energy pretending not to feel them. We didn't rush anything, didn't feel the need to, given that we already knew each other better than either of us had ever known anyone else. Reese moved a toothbrush into my bathroom within the first week, and a drawer's worth of clothes within the second, and neither of us made a big production out of it, because it felt less like a new beginning and more like something we'd simply been building toward for years without either of us naming it. The first genuinely new thing, the part that felt different from 9 years of friendship, was waking up next to her. I remember the first morning clearly. Gray, early light coming through the curtains she'd picked out weeks before either of us had admitted anything, her hair a mess against my pillow, and the specific quiet astonishment of realizing that the person I'd spent 9 years calling my best friend was now also, somehow, the person I woke up next to. She caught me staring at her that first morning, cracked one eye open, and said, without missing a beat, "You're doing the face again." "What face?" "The one where you look like you can't quite believe this is real. You've been doing it since the balcony." She reached over and poked my chest. Affectionate rather than teasing. "Get used to it. Reid. I'm not going anywhere." "Good," I said, and meant it more than I'd meant almost anything in years. It was about a month into officially being together that the first real complication showed up, in the form of a text message from a name Reese hadn't mentioned in over a year. I was in the kitchen making dinner when her phone buzzed on the counter, and I watched her face change as she read it. Something tightening behind her eyes that I hadn't seen since the early days of our friendship. Back when she was still working through the aftermath of her last serious relationship. "Who is it?" I asked, keeping my voice easy, not wanting to crowd her. "Grant." She said the name like it cost her something. "My ex. He wants to grab coffee. Says he's been thinking about us a lot lately. Wants to talk things through properly, instead of how we left it." I knew the outline of that relationship secondhand, pieced together over years of late-night conversations. Grant Ashworth had dated Reese for 2 years, most of college, and just after, and had, by her account, spent most of that relationship keeping her at a careful, deliberate distance. Always the one deciding when things moved forward. Always the one Reese was waiting on, hoping he'd finally choose her the way she'd already chosen him. He'd ended things eventually, abruptly, with an explanation that amounted to not being ready for anything serious, only to reappear periodically over the years whenever his life felt unsteady, testing whether the door was still open. I remembered the last time he'd resurfaced, about 2 years back, before Reese and I were anything more than best friends. Remembered sitting on her couch while she cried over a 2-word text he'd sent her out of nowhere. Remembered thinking, even then, with a jealousy I hadn't let myself examine, that he didn't deserve the amount of power he still held over her mood with so little effort. "What are you going to do?" I asked, careful to keep any edge out of my voice, though something protective and unhappy had already started uncoiling in my chest. "I don't know yet." She set the phone down, rubbing her temples like the message had given her an instant headache. "I hate that he can still do this. Show up out of nowhere and make me feel unsteady. Right when everything in my actual life is finally solid. You don't owe him anything. I know that. Knowing it and feeling it aren't always the same thing." She looked up at me, something vulnerable in her expression that I hadn't seen much of in 9 years of friendship, mostly because she'd always been so careful to keep that particular door closed, even with me. "Can we talk about it properly? Not right now. Dinner's getting cold. But soon. There's a lot about that relationship I've never actually told you." We talked about it 2 nights later, sitting on the floor of the living room with a bottle of wine between us. In the same spot we'd once eaten pizza off paper plates the night the whole thing started. "I spent 2 years being the person who waited," she said quietly, staring at her glass instead of at me. "Grant never actually chose me. Not really. He kept me around because it was convenient, because I was patient and understanding and never pushed too hard. And I told myself that was love, being endlessly patient for someone who couldn't quite commit to choosing me back. That's not love. That's just waiting. I know that now. It took me a long time to figure it out." She pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them, a posture I recognized from years of watching her get small whenever a conversation touched something tender. "There was this one time, junior year, when he told me he needed space to figure out what he wanted. And I waited 3 months without a single word from him, convinced myself that was normal, that real love meant being patient enough to wait for someone to be ready. And then he came back like nothing had happened. And I was just so relieved he'd chosen to come back at all that I never once asked him to account for the 3 months. Never asked him to actually choose me the way I'd been choosing him the entire time. I didn't know it was that bad. I never told anyone how bad it actually was. Not even you. And you knew almost everything else about my life during those years." She finally looked up, something raw in her expression. I think I was ashamed of it. Honestly. Ashamed that I'd let someone treat me like an option instead of a priority for that long and called it a relationship. I reached over and took her hand, not saying anything yet, giving her room to keep going if she wanted to. "The bed thing. That first night at your apartment, I need you to know that wasn't as spontaneous as it probably looked. I'd been trying to work up the nerve to say something for months, and I chickened out every single time. And that night I finally just blurted out something small enough that I could pretend it was a joke if you didn't react the way I was hoping. You were testing the water. I was testing the water in the safest way I could figure out. Because after Grant, I promised myself I'd never again put myself in a position where I was fully exposed and could be fully rejected. A joke about bedsides felt safe. If you'd laughed it off, I could have laughed too and pretended I never meant anything by it." She wrapped her arms around her knees, smaller than I usually saw her. "I don't want to be the person who's always waiting anymore. Nolan, I don't want to spend this relationship the way I spent that one, hoping you'll eventually choose me for real instead of just going along with something convenient. I already chose you," I said, meaning it completely, closing the distance between us on the floor and taking her hand. "I chose you on the balcony. I chose you every single day for the past month since. I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not going to make you wonder about that the way he did. I believe you," she said, and I watched her actually let herself believe it. Some old, careful guardedness finally easing out of her shoulders. "I still have to answer him, though. Tell him no, clearly, so there's no ambiguity left for either of us to hide behind. Do you want me there when you do it?" "No, I need to do this part myself, but thank you for asking." She texted Grant back the next morning, a message she showed me afterward, short and unambiguous, thanking him for reaching out but telling him she'd moved on, was happy, and didn't need to revisit anything from their past. He didn't respond for 2 days, And when he finally did, it was a single line. Something about hoping she was making the right choice. A small, familiar attempt to plant doubt on his way out the door one more time. Reese read it, showed it to me without a flicker of hesitation, and deleted it without responding. A small, deliberate act that felt like the actual ending of something that had been quietly unresolved for years. He doesn't get to do that anymore, she said, setting her phone face down on the counter. Plant a little seed of doubt and disappear again. I'm done being unsettled by him. Grant tried one more time. About 3 weeks later, showing up unannounced at the vet clinic where Reese worked, claiming he needed advice about a friend's dog. An obvious pretext that fooled absolutely no one. Reese called me from the break room during her lunch. Voice tight with a frustration I understood immediately. He's here, in the lobby, pretending he needs advice about a dog he doesn't actually have. Do you want me to come down there? No. I want to handle this myself. But I wanted you to know in case I come home more annoyed than usual. There was a pause, and when she spoke again, her voice had steadied into something more resolved. I think I actually needed this. One more chance to be completely clear with him. In person. So there's no ambiguity left at all. You've got this, I told her. You don't owe him kindness he never gave you. I know. She was quiet for a second. I'm still glad you're on the other end of this call. Though, it helps, knowing you're there. She handled it. She told me later that evening, by walking out to the lobby, telling Grant plainly that she wasn't interested in reconnecting. That she was in a serious relationship with someone who actually showed up for her consistently, instead of only when it was convenient. And that she needed him to stop reaching out entirely. He'd looked, she said, genuinely surprised. Like some part of him had never fully believed she'd stop being available to him eventually, the way she always had been for 2 full years of college. He asked who. She told me, curled up against my side on the couch that night. I told him it was you, he said, and I quote, Nolan, your best friend Nolan, like the concept was genuinely difficult for him to process. What did you say? I said yes, my best friend Nolan, the person who's actually shown up for me every single day for 9 years, which is apparently a concept some people struggle to understand. She tilted her head up to look at me. It felt good, honestly, saying it out loud, clearly, with no room left for him to wonder about it. How do you feel now? Lighter, like I finally closed a door I'd left cracked open for way too long without realizing it. She settled back against me, and I felt something in my own chest loosen too. A tension I hadn't fully registered until it was gone. The quiet, protective worry that Grant's reappearance might somehow unsettle something we'd only just built. The rest of that autumn passed the way I imagine most good things pass, once you stop bracing for them to fall apart. Steadily, without much drama. The two of us settling into a life together that felt less like a leap and more like the natural conclusion of 9 years spent circling the same conclusion without either of us willing to name it. Jordan gave me endless grief at the shop about how obvious we'd apparently been the whole time. Claimed he'd had money on us getting together within the year and had been collecting on the bet from 3 separate co-workers for weeks. Mila, when we ran into her at another mutual friend's wedding a few months later, greeted the news with an entirely unsurprised finally that made both of us laugh. Reese introduced me to her parents properly that winter, driving down to Ohio for a weekend that I'd spent most of the preceding week nervous about. Despite having technically met them a handful of times over the previous 9 years as her best friend, there was something different about meeting them as her boyfriend instead. A shift in the stakes that made even small talk feel weightier than it had any right to. Her father, a retired high school teacher with an easy, unhurried way of talking, pulled me aside during a walk after dinner and asked me, without much preamble, whether I understood what I was taking on. She spent a long time being the person who gives more than she gets, he said, hands in his coat pockets, looking out at the frozen backyard instead of at me. I don't say that to scare you off. I say it because I want to know you understand it. Going in. I understand it, I told him. I've watched her do it for other people for 9 years. I don't intend to be one more person she has to give more to than she gets back. He studied me for a long moment, The same appraising look I imagined he'd given plenty of students over the decades, and eventually nodded, apparently satisfied enough for the moment. Good answer. We'll see if you live up to it. I did my best to, over the following months, and by the time we got married the following autumn, a small ceremony at the same apartment where it had all started, her father gave a brief, warm toast of his own that referenced that frozen backyard conversation, saying he'd walked away from it convinced I actually meant what I'd said, and that watching the year since had only confirmed it. Jordan stood up as my best man with a toast that somehow managed to reference the bed frame incident in front of the entire assembled guest list, much to Reese's mortified delight. Her mother pulled me aside at the reception to tell me she'd suspected something was there long before either of us had admitted it, going back years, to a Thanksgiving visit where she'd watched the way I looked at her daughter across a crowded table and known, with a mother's particular certainty, exactly what she was looking at. I almost said something to her back then. Reese's mother told me, holding a glass of champagne and looking entirely too pleased with herself. But I've learned over the years that these things work themselves out on their own timeline, and pushing usually just makes people dig in their heels. I'm glad I waited. I'm gladder still that it finally happened. Mila came to the wedding too, and cornered me by the bar at one point to remind me, with obvious satisfaction, that she'd been the one to first say it out loud at the housewarming party. A claim to credit that Jordan disputed loudly for the rest of the evening, insisting his toast had done the actual heavy lifting. The two of them argued about it, good-naturedly, through most of the reception, neither willing to concede the point, until Reese finally settled the matter by declaring that credit belonged jointly to both of them, plus her own mother, plus 9 years of everyone else who'd apparently seen it coming long before either of us had. The bed frame itself still sits in our bedroom, the same one we built wrong and then rebuilt correctly that first night, a little scuffed now from years of use, and Reese still sleeps on the left side, exactly as promised, a fact we reference constantly, a small private joke that's become one of the load-bearing pieces of our whole relationship, the same way that first joking not joking question became the foundation everything else got built on top of. Some evenings, when the shop's closed and the clinic's quiet, and we're both home early enough to actually cook dinner together instead of just ordering takeout, Reese brings up that first night, asks me what I would have said if I'd answered her question honestly right there in the unfinished apartment, instead of taking 2 more weeks and a housewarming party to work up the nerve. I don't know. I tell her, honestly, every time she asks. I think I would have said the left side too. I think some part of me already knew, standing there with a screwdriver, completely unprepared for how much that question was actually asking. You looked so panicked, she says, laughing, like I'd asked you to defuse a bomb instead of pick a side of a mattress. You basically had. I just didn't have the nerve to admit it yet. I almost didn't ask it at all. You know, I stood there for a full minute deciding whether to say something safer, something that wouldn't risk anything. And then I just blurted it out before I could talk myself out of it. She stirs whatever we're cooking, not quite looking at me. I think I needed it to be small enough to survive rejection. If you'd laughed and said, "Ha, funny," whichever side you want, I could have told myself I'd meant it as a joke and moved on. It was the safest version of honesty I could manage. I'm glad you managed even that much. I don't think I would have said anything at all. Left to my own devices, I would have kept circling it for another year. Easily. That's probably true. You're stubborn about admitting things, even to yourself. She leans over and kisses me. Easy and familiar in the way that 9 years of friendship built into something more tends to make even the newest gestures feel worn in and comfortable. You got there eventually. That's what actually mattered. We've talked, once or twice, about what our lives might look like now if that housewarming party had gone differently, if Mila had never cornered me at the counter, if Jordan had never raised his glass in front of the whole room. Reese thinks we'd have gotten there eventually anyway, just slower. Maybe another wedding's worth of dancing to slow songs neither of us particularly liked before one of us finally cracked. I'm less certain. I think about how easily 18 months could have become 3 years, 5 years, an entire decade of careful, comfortable distance neither of us ever quite worked up the nerve to close. Both of us, growing old as each other's plus ones at other people's weddings. Joking about being basically married without either of us ever admitting we meant it. You're overthinking it, Reese tells me, whenever I bring up that particular hypothetical. We got here. That's what matters. I don't need to know what would have happened in some version of our lives where I never said anything. Because in this version, I did, and you eventually caught up. And now we're standing in our own kitchen, arguing about a question that already has an answer. She's right. Mostly. Though I still find myself grateful, in a specific and recurring way, for the exact sequence of small accidents that got us here: a bakery apartment with good light, a badly written set of assembly instructions, a housewarming party, neither of us fully planned to be an intervention, and one blunt coworker with absolutely no filter who happened to say the true thing out loud before either of us worked up the nerve to say it ourselves. Jordan still claims full credit for the toast. Insists it was the actual turning point, not Mila's comment at the counter. A debate the two of them apparently intend to keep having at every future gathering for the rest of our lives, regardless of how many times Reese and I try to point out that both moments mattered roughly equally. I've stopped trying to settle the argument. It's become its own small tradition, the two of them squabbling over credit, while Reese and I exchange a look across whatever room we're in. The specific private amusement of two people who know the real answer doesn't actually depend on who said what first, only on the fact that somebody, eventually, said something at all. I think, sometimes, about how differently the whole story might read if I were telling it from any other angle. If I hadn't been the one standing there with a screwdriver, panicking over 4 ordinary words that turned out to be anything but ordinary. I think about how many other people, in exactly that moment, might have laughed it off entirely, might have let the joke stay a joke out of fear or caution or simple bad timing, and how easily that version of the story ends with two people still circling each other a decade later, still making the same tired joke at weddings, never quite finding the nerve to make it true. I got lucky, is the short version. Lucky that Reese asked at all. Lucky that Mila had no filter. Lucky that Jordan raised his glass at exactly the right moment. Lucky, more than anything, that 9 years of careful friendship had built something sturdy enough to survive the risk of turning into something else entirely. Not every friendship gets that lucky. Not every quiet, unspoken thing gets the specific combination of circumstances required to finally come out into the open, instead of just fading, slowly, into two people who used to be close and eventually drifted, each convinced the other one never felt the same way. We're still building things together, is I suppose the most honest way to put it. The same way we built that bed frame wrong on the first try, then correctly on the second, then have kept sleeping in it. Her on the left, me on the right, every night since. Some nights the building looks like ordinary domestic life. Groceries and dinner, and arguing gently about whose turn it is to do dishes. Other nights it looks like harder conversations, the kind that require the same patient, deliberate care I'd apply to a difficult joint in the shop, sanding down the rough edges slowly instead of rushing past them. I think that's probably the actual secret, if there is one. Not the grand gesture, not the perfect declaration, but the willingness to keep showing up and keep building, one ordinary day at a time. Long after the first exciting rush of finally saying the true thing out loud has settled into something steadier and quieter and, in its own way, even better. I think about Jordan's warning sometimes too, the one he gave me at the shop weeks before any of it came out into the open. About figuring things out before one of us said the wrong thing at exactly the wrong moment. He wasn't wrong to worry. There were a dozen ways that housewarming party could have gone differently. A dozen moments either of us could have retreated back into the safety of 9 years of careful distance instead of finally saying the true thing out loud. I think about how close I came to letting Mila's blunt observation and Jordan's public toast pass without ever actually acting on either of them. How easily 18 months of careful avoidance could have stretched into another year, another 2 years. Both of us circling the same unspoken thing indefinitely, out of fear of losing what we already had. Jordan brings it up occasionally too, usually at the shop, usually while we're both elbow deep in some client's cabinet project, reminding me with obvious satisfaction that he'd called it years before either of us admitted anything, that he'd watched me talk about Reese with a specific fondness no ordinary friendship explained, long before that housewarming party ever gave either of us cover to say so out loud. I should get a cut of the wedding budget, he told me once, not entirely joking. Emotional labor. Years of watching you two dance around it, biting my tongue until I finally couldn't anymore. You get to be best man. That's the cut. Fine. But I'm bringing it up in every toast for the rest of our lives. Just so you know. Every anniversary. Every milestone. I called it, and I intend to be remembered for calling it. There's a version of this story, I suppose, where I tell it as a lesson about courage, about finally working up the nerve to say the true thing out loud. I don't think that's quite accurate. Though, it wasn't courage that got us here. Not really. It was Reese. Mostly, asking a question small enough to survive rejection. And Mila, blunt enough not to care whether she was overstepping. And Jordan, sentimental enough underneath all his teasing to finally say the real thing out loud in front of a room full of people. My own contribution was mostly just showing up. Eventually, once everyone else had already done the harder work of forcing the truth into the open. I've made my peace with that. Not every story needs its narrator to be the brave one. Sometimes it's enough to just be the one who finally, gratefully, caught up, and stayed caught up, one ordinary evening after another, for as long as she'll have me. Which, as far as either of us can tell right now, looks like the rest of both our lives. And if some future version of us ever forgets how it started, there's always the bed frame in the corner of our room to remind us, a little scuffed, still standing, still holding up exactly the weight it was built for, on both sides, exactly the way we always meant it to. Reese still teases me, occasionally, about how long it took me to actually answer the question properly, pointing out that it technically took 2 weeks and a housewarming party for me to give her a real response to something she'd asked outright on the very first night. I remind her, every time, that she'd built in an escape hatch, specifically so neither of us would have to answer honestly right away. That the whole point of framing it as a joke was so she wouldn't have to risk a real answer either. She usually concedes the point, though never without pointing out that I still took longer than strictly necessary to catch up to something she'd apparently already decided months before that housewarming party ever happened. I was protecting the friendship. I tell her, whenever this particular argument resurfaces, usually late at night, both of us too comfortable and too tired to actually disagree about anything with real heat behind it. 9 years is a long time to risk on a hunch. It wasn't a hunch. It was obvious. Jordan saw it. Mila saw it. My mother apparently saw it before either of us did. She pokes me in the ribs. Affectionate, rather than accusing. You were just scared. I was scared. I admit. Because it's true. And because there's no reason left to hide it now. I'd rather have been scared and eventually honest than safe and always wondering. Good answer, she says, and settles back against me, on the same bed we built wrong on the first try, correctly on the second, and have slept in together. Her on the left, me on the right, every night since. Some nights, when neither of us can sleep, we end up talking through the whole thing again anyway, tracing the same familiar shape of the story, the bed frame, and the screwdriver, and the housewarming party, and Jordan's toast. The way you revisit a favorite story not because you've forgotten the ending but because you like living inside it again for a few minutes. Tell it again, she says sometimes, half asleep, her voice already going soft with exhaustion. The bed frame part. You were standing right there. I remind her, every time. You know exactly how it went. I like hearing you tell it. You always leave out how panicked you actually looked. And I like reminding you. I wasn't panicked. I was processing. You were panicked, she says, laughing into my shoulder, and I let her have the last word on it. Mostly because she's right. And mostly because 9 years and one very ordinary, a very consequential question about which side of a mattress belonged to whom, taught me that some arguments aren't actually worth winning. Not when losing them means getting to fall asleep next to the person who asked in the first place. What would you have done if your best friend asked which side of your bed was theirs? Half joking, and you weren't sure whether to take it seriously. Would you have answered honestly right away? Or would you have needed time to work up the nerve the way I did? Have you ever had a friendship quietly turn into something more? Right in front of everyone except the two of you? Tell your story in the comments below. And if you'd like to be a little closer to us, we've opened memberships where you'll get shorter exclusive stories every week with no ads. If you enjoyed this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.